Sooner or later, someone is going to ask you this question. If the Bible starts with one couple, where did black people come from? I used to have no real answer for that. I'd shrug, mumble something about we're all human, and change the subject, because honestly, I didn't know where in Scripture to even look. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Most people answer this with guesswork. Some reach for conspiracy theories. Almost nobody reaches for the one place in the Bible that actually answers it, with names, with places, with entire nations spelled out plainly, in a lot more detail than you'd expect. Here's the part that genuinely bothered me once I found it. The chapter where all of this is hiding is exactly the chapter everybody skips. It's a wall of unfamiliar names most Bible readers scroll past on their way to something that feels more interesting. So stick with me, because somewhere in the middle of this video, I'm going to show you the biggest lie ever taught about this subject. A lie that got repeated from actual American pulpits for generations. And I'm going to show you, verse by verse, exactly how the text itself tears that lie apart. If you grew up in church, you've heard the flood story a dozen times. Noah, the ark, the animals, the rainbow. What almost nobody teaches you is what happens right after the water goes down. Because that's exactly where this answer is hiding. Without further ado, let's open the chapter nobody opens. If deep dives like this are your kind of thing, consider subscribing. It's free, and it genuinely helps a small channel like this one keep making them. Everything starts after the flood. When the waters finally go down, humanity doesn't restart with a brand new Adam and Eve. It restarts with one family that survived the boat, Noah, and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to the text, every nation on earth traces back to one of those 3 names. Every single one without exception. No fourth branch, no side door, no people group left dangling outside the family tree. And this is where we land on the chapter almost nobody reads closely, Genesis chapter 10. Scholars actually gave it a name, the Table of Nations. That's not a devotional nickname somebody made up to sound nice in a sermon. That's a technical label, because that's literally what the chapter is. A record, a kind of ancient census, an inherited map of humanity, sorting out which people group descended from which son of Noah, region by region, name by name. I'll be honest, the first time I actually sat down and read Genesis 10 start to finish, it felt like reading the fine print on a contract. Name after name after name, most of which I couldn't pronounce. But that's exactly the mistake I want to save you from making, because buried in that fine print is one of the most direct answers in the entire Bible to a question people insist Scripture avoids. The chapter splits into 3 branches, and each one moves in a different direction. Japheth's line heads north and west, eventually populating what we now recognize as Europe and parts of Asia. Shem's line settles in the Middle East, and this is the branch the Hebrews themselves descend from later on. Fair warning, we're not spending much time on those 2 branches today, because it's the 3rd one that actually matters for this video. Ham's descendants move south and west, down into Africa and the lands around it. I need you to sit with that for a second, because that's the exact moment the Bible starts recording the origin of black peoples. Not later, not as a footnote added on by some later editor. Right here in the opening genealogy of the entire started human race. And here's the detail that actually surprised me. Genesis doesn't just say, and some people went to Africa, and move on to the next paragraph. It names names. Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 14, opens up Ham's family tree directly. 4 sons. And each one isn't just a person, each one is the ancestor of an entire nation. Hold that thought, because we're about to meet all 4 of them, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Before we get to those 4 names, I want to be honest about how this question usually gets handled, because I think you deserve to know why the popular answers fall short. The first response is just guesswork. Somebody asks where black people come from, biblically speaking, And the answer is a shrug or a vague, well, we're all descended from Adam, which is technically true and explains absolutely nothing. It's not really an answer. It's a polite way of avoiding the question entirely, the theological equivalent of it's complicated. The second response lives in conspiracy theory territory, people arguing the Bible simply erases Black history, or that certain peoples were written out of the text on purpose, edited out by whoever controlled the manuscripts. I get the instinct behind that, I really do, especially given how this history has actually been misused. But it falls apart the moment you actually open Genesis 10, because the text does the exact opposite of erasing anyone. If anything, it names Africa's peoples with more precision than it names some of the peoples closer to Israel geographically. And then there's the one that did the most damage historically, the so-called curse of Ham. For generations, this was taught in actual American pulpits, cited in actual defenses of slavery written by actual theologians, printed in actual pamphlets circulated to justify the entire economic system of the antebellum South, as if the Bible itself declared that Black people were cursed to serve. As if it was written in black and white that this was God's design, permanent and unquestionable, settled before anyone in the pew could raise a hand and ask a follow-up question. Here's the problem with all three of these. The guesswork ignores an entire chapter of Scripture. The conspiracy theory ignores that Genesis 10 names these nations with more specificity than almost any other genealogy in the whole Bible. And the curse, I'll be honest with you, when I finally went back and reread it myself, slowly, verse by verse, something didn't add up. Something about who Noah actually curses doesn't match what centuries of preachers claimed it said. I'm going to come back to that. Hold that thought, because it's the biggest reveal in this entire video. But first, let's open Ham's family tree and meet these 4 sons by name, because everything else we talk about today builds on this. So who are they? Genesis 10:6 opens with the list: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. These aren't just 4 guys with 4 names, like a roster you're supposed to memorize for a quiz. In the world of ancient genealogies, a name like this almost always functions as what scholars call an eponym, the founder name of an entire people group. When the text says Cush, it doesn't just mean one man named Cush. It means the nation of Cush. Start with Cush. This is the ancient name for the land south of Egypt, what we'd recognize today as Ethiopia, Sudan, and parts of East Africa. This isn't a throwaway detail buried in one obscure verse, either. The word Cush shows up more than 50 times across the Old Testament, almost always pointing straight at this southern civilization. A civilization of real power, real wealth, real antiquity, with its own kings, its own armies, its own trade network stretching along the Nile. This region would go on to build its own pyramids, older and in some cases more numerous than Egypt's, and its own dynasties that, at points in ancient history, ruled over Egypt itself rather than the other way around. One of the oldest, richest cultures in the ancient world, named directly by God on the pages of the 4th book of the Bible. Next, Mizraim. This is the Hebrew name used from the first page of the Bible to the last, every single time the text talks about Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the pyramids, the great dynasties that outlasted empire after empire around it. Genesis explicitly classifies this as a Hamitic civilization, which means, according to the text's own family tree, Egypt's ancient roots run straight through Ham, not through Shem, not through Japheth. Then there's Put, which most scholars identify with ancient Libya and the broader region of North Africa, a name that shows up again later in the prophets, usually listed alongside Cush and Egypt as one of the great powers of the region, sometimes even mentioned as a source of soldiers and mercenaries respected enough to be named in the same breath as Egypt's own armies. And finally, Canaan, the youngest son, who settles in the territory that will later become the Promised Land. His descendants are the people the Israelites eventually encounter when they arrive there, generations down the road. Lock in these 4 names because everything else in this video builds on them. Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan, 3 of them map directly onto Africa. And one of them, Canaan, is about to matter more than you think, for a reason that has nothing to do with skin color, and everything to do with a lie that outlived centuries of Bible teaching. Let's stay with Cush a little longer, because this is genuinely one of my favorite corners of Genesis 10. The text doesn't stop at naming him and moving on, it keeps going. Cush has sons of his own: Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. 5 names, 5 peoples, all spreading out across a vast region, as the text puts it, leaving their mark on nations known throughout the ancient world for trade and wealth. And Rama has 2 sons listed by name, Sheba and Dedan. That's not filler either. Sheba and Dedan show up again and again elsewhere in the Old Testament, tied to caravan trade, incense, gold, spices moving along desert trade routes that connected Africa to Arabia to the Fertile Crescent. This is a civilization the biblical writers clearly assume their audience already respected. Nobody spends this much ink on a footnote. And there's one more son of Cush worth pulling out on his own, because it's the kind of detail that quietly changes how you read the rest of this chapter: Nimrod. Genesis 10:8 tells us Cush was the father of Nimrod, described as a mighty one on the earth, and Nimrod is the man the text credits with founding the earliest kingdoms in Mesopotamia, including a city called Babel. Sit with that for a second. The very bloodline the Bible traces down into Africa is the same bloodline credited with founding Babel, the place where, just 1 chapter later, humanity's languages get scattered across the earth. Hold on to that connection. We're coming back to it in just a minute, because it matters more than it looks like right now. Okay, now, if you've been paying close attention to this family tree, there's probably an uncomfortable question already forming in your head. It's the exact question people have used for generations to try to knock down the whole Bible in one move. If everyone came from one couple, and then from one family, Noah's family, how did black skin, white skin, brown skin, every shade in between, actually happen? How does that much difference grow out of a single starting point? It can feel like the Bible has no answer here, like this is the one place where the text just goes quiet. But it doesn't, and the answer comes in 3 pieces, and once you put all 3 together, the picture assembles itself almost on its own. Piece 1. Every child is a brand, new genetic combination. You're not a copy of your father, and you're not a copy of your mother. You're a blend of both, shuffled in a way that's never happened before and will never happen exactly that way again. And every generation after that blends again and again and again. Just from that mechanism alone, human variation multiplies fast, compounding generation over generation. This isn't a stretch or a theological workaround. It's basic inheritance, and it was true the moment Adam and Eve had their first children. Piece 2, the scattering. God's instruction after the flood was clear: fill the earth, spread out, don't cluster together in one spot forever. And when humanity resists that instruction and clusters together instead, building upward instead of outward, Babel is where God forces the issue, confusing the languages and pushing the scattering forward whether people wanted it or not. Remember Nimrod, the founder of Babel, descended from Cush. That's not a coincidence tucked quietly into the margins of the chapter. That's the same family line sitting right at the hinge point where humanity gets pushed out across the globe. Groups end up scattered into radically different environments almost overnight, geologically speaking. Scorching desert on one side of the map, frozen, ice-bound territory on the other. And here's the third piece, the one that actually ties the whole thing together: melanin. Melanin is the pigment that gives skin its color. More melanin, darker skin. less melanin, lighter skin. And it has a function beyond just appearance. It protects the body from solar radiation. It's a sunscreen god built directly into human skin from the very beginning, engineered right into the biology. Now put melanin together with the scattering and watch what happens. Whoever ends up where the sun is unforgiving, equatorial Africa, the tropics, the regions Cush's descendants settled into, needs more protection from that radiation. Too little melanin under that kind of sun leaves the body vulnerable, generation after generation, to the kind of skin damage that actually costs lives over time. More melanin is a straightforward survival advantage there. Skin trends darker over time, not because of anything arbitrary, but because that's what keeps a body healthy under that particular sky. Whoever ends up in the cold, the far north, has the opposite problem. Not enough sun, and the body still needs to produce vitamin D from what little sunlight does reach it. Lighter skin has the advantage there, because it captures that limited light more efficiently, and over generations, skin trends lighter. Neither direction is better than the other. Each is simply what that environment rewards, the same way a plant's leaves adapt to shade or full sun, without anyone calling one version of the plant superior to the other. Here's what that actually means, and I think this is genuinely one of the more beautiful things in all of Scripture once you actually see it laid out. The variation wasn't added later, like some kind of divine afterthought. It was already there, complete from the very beginning. Adam and Eve, and later, Noah's family, every single one of them, already carried the full color palette of humanity inside their own genes. The scattering just distributed that palette across the earth, and the sun of each region simply decided which shades would become common where people happened to settle. In other words, there aren't different races that came from different origins, like separate starting points scattered across the map. There's one human family, scattered across the world by circumstance and by design. And the sun over each piece of ground painted the descendants of Adam in different tones. The same way light falling differently across a single canvas brings out different colors already present in the paint. That truth is honestly one of my favorite things about this whole chapter, and it's exactly why what happened to it next bothers me so much. Because that beautiful truth got buried for centuries under a lie. You may have already heard of it. It's called the curse of Ham. And for generation after generation, in sermons, in pamphlets, in actual theological defenses written to justify chattel slavery in this country, it was used to say that black people were born to serve. That it was written in the Bible, that it was God's own will, settled and beyond debate. There's a massive problem with that story. When you actually open the text and read it carefully, slower than a sermon usually allows, it falls apart right in front of you. Go back to Genesis chapter 9. Here's what happens. After the flood, Noah plants a vineyard, drinks its wine, and gets drunk in his own tent. Ham sees his father's nakedness, and instead of covering him with any kind of respect, the way his brothers do moments later, he goes out and exposes it, tells his brothers about it. When Noah wakes up and realizes what happened, he pronounces a curse. But pause and read that again, because this is the part that changes everything. Pay very close attention to who he curses. It is not Ham. It is not the peoples of Africa. The curse lands on Canaan, one single son of Ham, possibly connected somehow to that episode of humiliating his grandfather, though the text doesn't spell out exactly why the curse names him and not his father directly. We don't fully know, but here's how quickly a careful reading dismantles the whole lie. Canaan is the father of the Canaanites, the people who settled in the Promised Land in the Middle East, not in sub-Saharan Africa. The sons of Ham who gave rise to the peoples of Africa are Cush, Mizraim, and Put. Noah never curses them. Not one word, not one syllable, anywhere in the text. So let's say this plainly, without hedging, without softening it for anyone's comfort. The curse of Ham, used as a justification for enslaving black people, never had biblical grounding. Not one syllable of it. It was a lie invented by men, built to serve their own economic interests, and then handed down generation after generation as if it were scripture itself. Now take a step back and look at the whole picture. When you put these pieces together, something stronger stands up. Black peoples are not a footnote in the Bible. They are not a late addition, tacked on somewhere after the real story already happened. They're there from chapter 10 of Genesis, named by God, founding some of the oldest civilizations on the entire earth, civilizations the rest of the ancient world looked to for gold, for grain, for military strength, long before some of the nations we consider central to the biblical story had even formed. And that presence doesn't disappear after Genesis 10 like it did its one job and exited the story. When Moses marries a Cushite woman, his own sister Miriam and his brother Aaron criticize him for it. But God takes Moses' side and rebukes the two of them directly, going so far as to strike Miriam with leprosy over it. A fairly serious response, if you think about it, for what starts out sounding like a family disagreement. It was an African man, Ebed Melech, a court official with everything to lose by getting involved, who found the courage to pull the prophet Jeremiah out of the bottom of a cistern, out of the mud, after every single person around Jeremiah had already given up on him and walked away. He didn't just report the problem. He personally gathered old rags and worn out clothes, lowered them down on ropes so the ropes wouldn't cut into Jeremiah's arms, and pulled him out himself. And in the heaviest hour in the whole story, when Christ is on the way to the cross with no strength left to carry that weight, the man the Gospels tell us steps in to lift the beam is Simon, from Cyrene in North Africa, pulled out of the crowd, as far as we can tell, with no warning at all. And remember the ancient prophecy that Cush will stretch out her hands to God. Centuries later, in the book of Acts, we watch that promised land, almost like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. A high official serving the Queen of Ethiopia, a man with real influence in charge of her entire treasury, meets Christ on a desert road while reading scripture in his own chariot, is baptized on the spot with nothing but the water they happen to find along the road, and carries the good news home with him without anyone forcing his hand. Nobody sends a missionary after him to make sure it counts. That man represents the good news reaching Africa exactly the way the psalmist said it would, because that's exactly where all of these threads have been pointing the entire time we've been tracing them today. So is the Bible really silent on where black people come from? I don't think that's a fair reading anymore, honestly. I think the honest answer is the opposite of silent. It names them first, before almost anyone else, in the very first genealogy after the flood, in a chapter most of us were taught to skip. And here's why that matters to me. Go all the way to the end of the Bible, to Revelation, to the vision of the throne, and look at who's gathered there. People from every tribe, every language, every people, every nation, standing together in front of the same throne. Heaven in this book was never painted in one color. I keep coming back to that image. One family scattered across the earth, colored by the same sun that answers to the same God. And every one of those threads we trace today, Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan, Moses' wife, Ebed, Melech, Simon, the eunuch on the road, all of them leading straight to the same throne. Did this change how you read Genesis 10? Or had you already come across some of this before today? Drop it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. And if you want more of these deep dives into the parts of Scripture nobody teaches, there's more waiting for you on this channel. Peace, and until next time.